It is now time, though, to turn things over to Dr. Mark Harmon, who is going to moderate our very first panel. And are you ready to go, Dr. Harmon?
I certainly am.
Thank you.
Yes, well, welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you. And it's a pleasure to welcome our panelists. I hope they're all here. I see Ray Suarez is here. And we are also expecting Rick Ducey and Joy Jenkins. And I don't know, Courtney, are the others here yet? I don't see them on the screen.
They probably, just a minute.
Okay. In the meantime, I will introduce Ray Suarez and thank him for doing this. If you don't know, Ray Suarez has a 30-year plus career in reporting, including stints with Al Jazeera America, PBS NewsHour. Currently is co-host of the weekly radio program World Affairs, presented by the World Affairs Council of Northern California and KQED FM. He just completed an appointment, McCloy Visiting Professor of American Studies at Amherst College in Massachusetts. NYU has called him a distinguished alumnus, as he indeed is. He holds an MA from the University of Chicago, and he will address some of the consequences of the demise of journalism and journalists, as well as the implications of misinformation and disinformation regarding social media and democracy in a free press. We are joined as well, I believe, yes, Dr. Joy Jenkins is here. A colleague of mine, assistant professor, School of Journalism, Electronic Media. She will give us a scholarly perspective on the way getting news is happening, changing. Before coming to the University of Tennessee, Dr. Jenkins served postdoctoral research in digital news at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. She has a PhD in journalism from the University of Missouri, MS in Mass Communications from Oklahoma State, BA in Journalism from University of Oklahoma. Is Rick Ducey here? I do not see Rick yet. If he joins us, he is with BIA Advisory Services, and we'll discuss the evil lords of finance, hedge funds. So that said, as I understand, what I originally planned is that each of our panelists would do a brief presentation about some of the overall points raised in the description of this session. And then I would follow with questions, and then we would open it to questions from all attendees. So if that format is acceptable to everybody, Joy, Ray, does anyone have a preference to go first and start presenting and chatting? Ray Suarez is fine with, he's deferring to Joy, I think. So Joy, if you would mind unmuting and going, we'll go from there. And if Joy has hosting privileges, which I think she does, she should be able to share screen. And
all right, I'm unmuted now. I'm happy to get started. All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, well, I wanted to get started by just showing a couple of charts on the growing importance of social media as a news source, which of course is one of the main themes of the session today and something we are going to explore the implications of. So I pulled a few charts from the digital news report from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, where, as Dr. Harmon mentioned, I did a postdoc before coming here to Tennessee. And for the last 9 years, they have done a massive survey of news consumers. And these are some of the results from the 2020 survey, which surveyed consumers in across 40 countries. So it's a really good gauge of some of the ways that news consumption is changing. So here on the far left, we can see over the last 9 years how online news has overtaken TV as the most frequently source of news in many of the countries covered by the survey. And so we can see that in that orange line here, how that is rising. And of course, print is here in the pink line on the bottom, with TV in the middle. And at the same time, printed newspapers have continued to decline while social media, which is that navy line, has had a sharp rise. And so pretty significant shifts in how people are getting their news. And of course, social media is one of the major sources that people have turned to get news information. Facebook remains by and large the most important social network for that, with YouTube also rising in importance. And another trend that's important to see, we can see WhatsApp here in the middle, and this is across 12 different countries. And so it's a composite of that. But there's a privatization of the way that people are talking about news. So turning to WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and private apps to have these conversations they might have previously had in more public spaces. But of course, Instagram and Snapchat are rising in popularity as well. Confirm, I know a lot of my students are in this webinar, and those are important sources for them. And so we're seeing how those platforms as well are taking advantage of interest in video and more visual ways of getting news. And next to that, I have a chart looking at this broken down by demographic, which is really important to consider. We're talking a lot about local media today, and local media in general have had a hard time, reaching those younger consumers. And so we see here among Gen Z, which is the age of a lot of our undergraduate students, they're preferring to go to social media and to search to get their news rather than going directly to websites for newspapers or TV networks or other types of sources. And we have to look at trust as well. I have a chart here. This is specifically focused on the US, where trust in news overall has been declining, largely as a result of our polarized political environment here in the US, but news and social is even less trusted. We have it at 14% here. And a lot of news consumers said that they combine their social media news with going to other types of sources to get credible information. They trust that they can recognize misinformation and disinformation when they encounter it, but it's really important to think about how that trust is declining as interest in social news as a news source rises. So local news in particular has been the area that I've been studying for the last several years. And this is a sector that has seen a lot of challenges in recent years. And I know the other panelists will address this as well. So seeing the implications of increased ownership consolidation, losses in advertising revenues because they're competing with platforms like Facebook and Google, the influence of social media as people go to seek free news from other types of platforms rather than buying subscriptions. And of course, a lot of this has seen implications through newspapers closing, through furloughs, and just the overall shrinkage of the local news market. And this is important because local news is considered to provide journalism that's often more trusted and less partisan than national outlets. And a lot of people see local news as, their most important sources of local information. And this is something that we particularly saw during the COVID epidemic starting in those early months. A lot of local news outlets saw unprecedented spikes in traffic as people sought out credible local information. And so it's really important to see how these local organizations are responding, particularly as many of them are still getting the bulk of their revenues from their print products. So I'm going to talk just briefly, because we wanted to keep these presentations short, but about some of the recent research that I've been doing on local and regional newspapers around Europe. And these interviews were conducted just about a year ago, and then I did some follow-up interviews in August to gauge some of the impact of the coronavirus epidemic on these news outlets. So the most significant aspect of digital transformation that I saw at the newspapers where I did interviews, and I have a list of them with their countries here, is the emphasis on paid content models online. So these outlets, as I mentioned, they're facing competition from Google and Facebook and other large platforms that can offer highly targeted digital advertising that's fairly cheap. And so local publishers are having to turn to other types of models to try to fund their work. And so as we see here, they're turning to subscription models, to freemium and premium models, to hybrid, where maybe you get a few articles for free and have to pay for some. In the UK, we're seeing micropayments where you pay, a couple of pence a month to get access, or even donation models. And so these outlets are seeing that they can't compete, with Facebook and Google for digital advertising, so they're having to look to other directions. And I also asked them about their relationships with platforms like Facebook and how they're changing. And when I first started talking with these outlets in 2018, a lot of them were getting significant proportions of their traffic from Facebook, between 15 and 40%. And a lot of them expressed concern about that, saying that they were worried about how much of their traffic was coming via Facebook, which of course, as Facebook decides to change an algorithm, that can have a big impact on how many readers are coming to their news. And so more recently, when I talked to them last year, they said they've kind of decreased their emphasis on Facebook as a source of traffic and tried to look to it in more strategic ways to figure out how it can be helpful to them as publishers. So here I have a few quotes that I pulled from some of the people I talked with. A publisher in the UK said that they're trying to be smarter about looking at the value of the audience. Their Facebook audience doesn't tend to be the people that pay for content or read longer stories. They're more looking at shorter stories that grab their attention. And so they're recognizing that and saying, okay, well, we might draw some of those readers, but they're probably not the ones that are going to get subscriptions. They also talk about Facebook's a way to extend their reach. It's a way to reach readers that they might not otherwise get to, younger readers, readers that may not engage with them on a regular basis. And so James Mitchinson, he's at the Yorkshire Post in Northern England. He said that Facebook, it's a great audience generator, but not necessarily a great revenue generator, again, because a lot of those people aren't necessarily going to pay for access. But finally, and this is really important to think about, Facebook is also a reporting tool. So a lot of these outlets are recognizing that they can use Facebook groups to connect with readers with different interests or in different parts of their communities. They can share links with them to stories. They can get story ideas from them. And so this is an editor in Germany who said, in previous decades, journalists went to the bar at night, but now they're in Facebook groups and they're using that as a reporting tool and a way to find story ideas. And I have an example here of a story that they did about people who'd overcome adversity. They did 40 profiles of people and they found a lot of those via Facebook interactions. I also wanted to talk briefly about the impact of COVID, as I mentioned previously. So for a lot of these outlets, it resulted in huge traffic spikes in the early days of the pandemic. They saw a lot of people coming to their outlets to get information about what was happening in their community and some of the impacts. And as a result, a lot of them dropped their paywalls. They dropped paid access to ensure that people had access to those stories. But as we see here from Paul Fisher, he's at a publisher in the UK, he said, you know, our coverage was more vital than ever before during the heights of the pandemic. But even though we were seeing that heightened traffic, we still saw shutdowns of some of the offices in downtown areas. We had furloughs and we had to reconfigure our workflows to ensure we were still providing enough articles for readers, even with fewer journalists to produce it, which is something that has lingered for a lot of these outlets. I also have an example here on the top right. This is a newspaper in France, and they did some solutions journalism where they invited their readers to ask them questions, and then they addressed them in a special section of the newspaper. On the bottom right is a local newspaper that kept its downtown office open, and it actually served as a place for NHS workers, so health service workers, to congregate and to collect donations and things. And then they also did their coverage of coronavirus in their community. And then this is my last slide, and then I'll go to the next speaker. Another way to think about the influence of platforms is some of the ways they're trying to inject funding into local news. This is an example in the UK called the Community News Project, where Facebook is planning to inject about $6 million to place 82 journalists in local community newsrooms, particularly to cover underserved and marginalized communities, based on generation, based on race, based on ethnicity, based on LGBTQ status, and other different types of markers. And one of the organizers said this has been successful just in the first couple of years. It's enabled our publishers to report on communities that have been underserved, and we've attracted diverse cohorts of journalists. And then one of the reporters I interviewed said that I think that the reporting I'm doing is making a difference, particularly in the neighborhoods she's covering, which is high crime, highly deprived. And she said it's typically been covered with a certain type of narrative. And I've been trying to push back on that and to do more positive human interest type stories. So this is an example of platforms attempting to give back, trying to shape local news in a way that these participants at least have said is effective. So I'll stop there, but I look forward to your questions after the other panelists.
Right. Well, thank you. Appreciate that, Joy. Let me turn now to Ray Suarez. And Ray, please, an opening statement or reaction to Joy's observations, wherever you want to take it.
Well, I look at this set of questions essentially as both an observer and a practitioner, someone who's been trying to make a living as a reporter inside this changing information ecosystem. In previous generations, the news business, as it's constituted at any one time, is always under pressure from new forms of competitors and from new forms of technological change. They present a challenge to the business as it's constituted, and the business has to adapt or die. Whether it's the transition from a very expensive non-ad revenue driven model of the mid-19th century newspaper, competing with the penny press, which is entirely or heavily underwritten, not by the purchase price, which is a penny or 2 pennies, but underwritten by ads. Whether it's the newspapers contending with the rise of radio news in the 30s and 40s, when you could no longer rely on the audience to wait until the next day to see the latest news, because they simply did not want to wait until the next day, because they knew that they could get their news in a matter of an hour or an hour and a half. But at least the newspaper could fall back on the fact that you had to be near a radio, and radios were not portable or ubiquitous. They weren't even standard equipment in automobiles for a long time. Then radio had to contend with the arrival of television, and over-the-air television had to eventually contend with the arrival of cable, and the no longer needing to wait until the few specific times a day that this piece of technology would deliver news. What was the through line? What was the one thing that all these various forms had in common? They were delivering news gathered and delivered by journalists. So at least they were doing the same thing, but they were doing it in a different way. So it was forms of delivery, using different forms of technology to get information into eardrums and eyeballs. What's different about now is that digital means of delivery have revolutionized the business by creating an essentially parasitic form of content delivery. That is, for the most part, the digital platforms that are winging you stuff constantly through your phone and your laptop and on and on and on are not news organizations. They employ few or no journalists, except in a charitable manner. And they have an essentially parasitic relationship with the established news business. So as this new form erodes the existing business, I mean, really erodes it, puts constant pressure on it as a business, it is also the source that's providing the content that they don't pay for to audiences. So you have a host that's being bitten by 1,000 parasites, weaker and weaker by the day, that's also delivering the content that these new players are using as an essential, as a cornerstone part of their business model. The idea that one of Facebook's core products is the delivery of news content that's created by other institutions is one of the most amazing 3-card Monte games in modern business. It is astounding. And it's taking legacy media to its grave, or in many cases, forcing institutions to become weak, shadowy, under-resourced versions of themselves. As now we see august institutions like the Chicago Tribune, a cornerstone news provider for a huge region in the middle of the country, being bought by a hedge fund that will turn it into a glorified shopper at some point, because they're going to lay off journalists. They're going to reduce the number of editions they put out. They are going to reduce their investment in the creation of content. And in this weird musical chairs game that the modern business has been playing, you'll have the source of the product that's been parasitized by the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Googles and on and on and on, going away gradually, dying by inches. And you wonder, well, you know, Dr. Jenkins mentioned a short time ago this model with Facebook subsidizing journalists to do their work. The cynical side of me says that that's essentially a PR exercise for an organization that's under tremendous public relations pressure. They don't want to become a news organization with all the responsibilities and overhead that involves. They want to keep the pressure off themselves so that nobody will see this essentially parasitic relationship for what it really is. You know, do these relationships deliver readers who eventually deliver revenue? It's a chimera. They are basically saying, no, page impressions, that'll eventually turn into a subscriber. Oh, don't worry. Don't put up a paywall. People will get to like your content, and once they rely on it, they'll start paying for it. Baloney. They will just search for new ways to get it for free. And along with this weakening and erosion of the core business has been the rise of a parallel business, which is doing something entirely different. That is, they're in the misinformation and disinformation business, but they provide it in a form that looks like, feels like, sounds like the conventional news business. In the past, there have been agitprop outlets, and there have been political persuaders, and there have been communicators who try to wink at the public and tell them that their information is as credible as what a journalist working for a news organization produces. But their stuff didn't feel, didn't look as credible. The Stormer used to be on mimeograph sheets with a staple up in the upper left-hand corner, and it looked different from the New York Times. Now the Stormer looks every bit as good as the New York Times webpage, and that has a tremendous subliminal message for the value of the information. It doesn't look like something cooked up in somebody's basement. And the misinformation industry can now compete on an equal footing with the actual news business. So along with the parasitic death of a thousand cuts relationship with this new delivery stream that really, in many cases, gets you nothing except the wink and the promise that someday down the road you may feel the echo effect of creating this halo effect around the quality of your content. The disinformation business is creating trust networks, parallel trust networks that are as credible or as believed by the credulous as any news organization.
Right.
Maybe we think we can fool around with that or kid around with it, but look at all the misinformation and disinformation that's been circulated around the pandemic, and you'll see that that's something that has a real life effect.
Wow. No, I think Ray Suarez and Joy Jenkins have got off to a great start. But there's one person who always has the ability to put it in terms that gets through to everybody, and that's John Oliver. And so we have, I think if Courtney is up to this, I think we have a video that we're going to show at least part of that I think explains the dilemma that Ray and Joy have talked about so eloquently in a more humorous vein. So Courtney, if you're ready with that, let's share that. Scared yet? All right. Thanks to all who brought that to my attention, and we really needed to play that. Now, I want to do some questions, but I think I want to start with what a student wrote in. A student wrote a question that I want to pose to both Ray and Joy. A student says, I hate social media for the misinformation and disinformation, but can I survive without it? And how can I, if not, how can I make it more tolerable? A great question. I'll make that a jump ball. Anyone want to take that first?
Sure, I don't mind answering briefly and giving some tips. I mean, I think that, social media can be a good starting point to find some credible news and to connect with journalists, who are doing good work. There's been research that's shown that among people who use social media for news, it does expose them to a wider variety of viewpoints and a variety of sources that they might not see otherwise. But I think the key there is to ensure that you're following outlets that you feel are doing good journalism, following particular journalists. I'm talking in the Twitter sense now, following good journalists, and also just really taking time to consider the content they're providing and whether it's serving those journalistic goals and in the public, interest. But I think alongside that, not getting all of it for free via social, please subscribe. Find a couple of outlets you can subscribe to. I know for students that are here, UTK offers access to some newspapers. A lot of outlets now have, discounts for younger readers and for students. And so partner your social media news access and news consumption with a few subscriptions too. And that can really help journalists do their work and continue to do that.
Ray, you want to add to that list?
Well, the junk info business is as technically adept as the real info business. The junk info business also has deep pockets and supporters who are supporting it for reasons other than public enlightenment. So what I used to believe would eventually be a flight to quality that would, through market forces, marginalize the junk info business. I'm not as sanguine about that possibility any longer. I think the news business is in a struggle to survive now. And if you don't pay for journalists, you'll get what you pay for, basically.
Okay. Let me point a question first to Joy, and then I'll pose one to Ray. You showed us that there was an increased use of social media, but low overall trust in it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if this is something akin to what I call the congressman schools effect. When it comes to congressmen and schools, they're all terrible except for your local one. And I'm just wondering if it's the same thing with the websites you choose to use or the social media sites that you tend to rely upon, that they're all terrible except for the ones that you use.
Yeah, definitely. And, research from the Reuters Institute showed that while trust in social was at 14%, trust in the news I use was at 45. So there's a big difference between those outlets that people seek out and find trustworthy and credible, and then just that overall news environment on social. But the high use of social is also representative of the different ways that we use it for conversations, for keeping in touch with people. Facebook has said that it's pivoting to more of that, seeing, news from family and friends rather than from news outlets, for mutual support and finding people that share our ideas with us. There's also, some of the responses to the survey that said that people feel pretty confident about their ability to recognize misleading information or disinformation, although it that's just a perception that people have, and when tested, sometimes that's not the case, and it is more difficult to parse out what's real and what's not. So yeah, definitely a big gap between the sources that people trust and that overall environment, and that's a source of concern, something to really consider why that gap is there and how to raise that level of quality.
Okay. The question I want to point to Ray is Rachel Maddow's most recent book, Blowout, in its closing pages has some rather disturbing numbers on just how successful the Internet Research Agency, which is a Russian troll farm in St. Petersburg, had on not only disrupting and influencing our elections, but just creating overall division and distrust, so much that it might just hurt our democracy deeply. Ray, what do we do about that as teachers, as students? What do we do to try to get people to figure out what's going on?
Just that set of givens that you laid out is disturbing enough. what adds to the upset that comes from that is that it was so cheap to do. Those Russian troll farms and others in what used to be the Eastern Bloc don't have great big budgets. You can shake American democracy for a fairly small expenditure, while senators and congressmen are on the phone around the clock raising millions and then eventually raising billions to run 2-year and 4-year and 6-year campaigns. The Russians shook our system and sent tremors through the information ecosystem for a relatively paltry expenditure. It's because of its vulnerability, not because of their willingness to spend. It was a pretty cheap operation. Click-through. They understand, as people working here understand, that click-through is very low. So what creates the buzz? What creates the impression? The headline and the photograph that accompanies it. You think you, quote unquote, know something because you saw an overheated and often purposely misleading headline about content, and only a small portion of the people who see that and have an impression created by it actually click through to read the story. And when you click through, you find that it's crap. It's just a bunch of sort of half-baked assertions that have no core and have no logical, sequential, expository line that you recognize from the news business that has the ring of truth, where you say, oh, this seems like it's right because the sort of seat of the pants epistemology that I used to get through my day, to be able to tell what's real and what's not, it just doesn't meet this test. They know that. They know that, pictures of Donald Trump arm wrestling the devil had as much effect as an actual closely, carefully written, extensively researched piece on the links of his business empire to various shady or corrupt influencers. So we're in real trouble. We have 330 million people walking around with a world in their heads, between their ears, that they create a pastiche from all these impressions and ideas and jokes that their friends posted and something that their friend told them. Somebody who is a very well-educated person, somebody I've known for a long time, called me very upset the other day to tell me not to get the COVID-19 vaccine, and then launched into a litany of reasons based on extensive reading in some of these crazy conspiracy sites. And when I tried to explain the holes in some of the arguments he was making, he was absolutely passionately convinced that it was a conspiracy by Big Pharma to basically rape the population and make big profits while doing it.
Ray, I
This
want to.
is disturbing.
Yeah, and I want to get to a political implication, because one of our fine instructors, Melanie Pfizer, asked a really good question about social media and particularly politicians, and even more particularly Donald Trump. Here we have a 4-year experience with a person who, by the Washington Post tally, told at least 30,000 falsehoods over that time. And yet, what do we do about this? I mean, is it proper for a Twitter or a Facebook to, in effect, deplatform someone who is so abusive? And what are the criteria for abusive? It can't be just not nice or rude. It probably should include false. What do you think about the deplatforming option and when to use it?
Well, the problem with that is that people who are immersed in this world and think it's working just great for them say lies. Who gets to say their lies? Maybe you're a liar, and you end up in a funhouse mirror of facts and lies being treated as equally interesting, equally valid, and equally taken on to create beliefs by a public. And earlier, you'll remember I said, we now have a disinformation business that is the parallel and the institutional parallel, a fleshed out, fully funded, technologically adept information system that is built to lie to you, just as we have one that's built to try to tell you the truth. Now it's a fair fight between the two of them. One used to be marginal. Now one is fully the equal of the other, and that's dangerous territory for a democracy. And I'm not sure what we do about it.
Yeah, and let me put a very similar question came out of our audience. Sarah Delaney Duncan writes, and I'll put this one first to Joy. Do you believe news will ever evolve out of heavily using social media because of its fickle and misleading nature? What do you believe happens if not? We saw on January 6th the power of combining social media and news/fake news. What's the end game here?
I mean, I think for particularly local news organizations, it's a complete rethinking of the model. Because as we've seen, this advertising-based, print-oriented, model that has funded these outlets for decades and for even longer, it's not going to hold. It's not going to work anymore for sustainability. And so it requires these organizations to rethink the role of these platforms and how they do their work, and to rethink how they engage with their audiences. And there's a lot of conversation right now about the power of collaboration, about local news organizations working together to better serve their communities and to better cover those topics around COVID and around other just challenging issues in society, to cover them better. Once we get into a place where we can have, in-person events again, getting out and connecting with people, and just thinking about, we can't just rely on Facebook and Twitter and these other sources to get some clicks and to people to see an article and that to drive our editorial decision making. It has to be about real engaged, sustainable relationships with readers, understanding what information they need to be good citizens, understanding communities that have not been covered fairly and equitably, and ensuring that they are, and really kind of leveraging the strengths of journalism and of journalists in ways that don't rely on these platforms that can change on a dime. As we've seen, these platforms, there's a lot of power there that nobody really knows how to grapple with at this point. And so there has to be a pivoting to other ways of doing journalism.
Well, let me build on that, because Ray Suarez, you have spent a good chunk of your career in non-commercial journalism and broadcasting. And when you look now at the winners of big journalism prizes and the people who are breaking stories, we're beginning to see it's coming from nonprofit entities like ProPublica, Texas Tribune, and smaller ones scattered around the country and beginning to form. Is that where we can hope the future of journalism will find a home, in nonprofit charitable stuff, and that the commercial world is just going to become and remain a mess?
It's kind of a bank shot, because you can't do a straightforward linear shot any longer. ProPublica, the Center for Public Integrity, I've been working for something called the American Communities Project. And I said to my editor, because I just wrote a big piece on deaths of despair in Montana. It's a pretty good piece. I said, well, who's the end user of this content? And he basically said, newsrooms. We're trying to encourage other newsrooms to take up this story. And you're in effect doing the first version of it and getting all the interviews and amassing all the data. And then we put it out there, and then newsrooms pick it up. And what do you know? After it was published, that's exactly what happened. And I'll be doing some more of them in the coming months. It's an unreliable model to move this to a not-for-profit model. You can't be sure that the indulgent donors or core millionaires who provide the seed capital for these operations have a longitudinal interest that you can bank on. I mean, so far it's been great. And none of the very generous, very public spirited people who've provided the money to get these things off the ground have said, forget it, I've lost interest, I'm going to do something else now. So far, so good. But, part of the idea, and, the Gates Foundation, Gates Family Foundation, also was funding a lot of news from big outlets. And it was one thing, we at the NewsHour had a multi-million-dollar, multi-year grant to cover global health. And we did a good job and we provided a lot of content to it. And we, at the end of our reporting, said, this reporting supported by a grant from the Gates Foundation. You might think, all right, I'll see that on the NewsHour. That makes sense. They don't make any money. They don't have any ads. But to see Gates Family reporting, subsidized reporting on ABC, which has enormous amounts of money, they just didn't want to spend it on that. So they're allowing these charitable foundations to subsidize their reporting. It's weird, and we're in uncharted territory now. So yes, great work is being done by the ProPublicas of the world. Whether that's a durable, longitudinally secure model, I don't know.
We're nearing the end, but I want to get in a question from our Dean, Mike Worth, who writes, what strategies can we use to increase media literacy among our citizenry? Let me point that first to Joy and ask, do we start that too late? I know we teach in our college classes. Should we be doing it in elementary school?
Yeah, no question. I mean, that we need to be teaching that among the youngest and starting in elementary on up. And, and that's things like understanding how journalism works and how journalism do their jobs. That's something that's still consistently a gray area, even among, those that are studying journalism. So how is journalism funded? How does that work? What resources are required to do good, high level public service reporting, really understanding that. And then understanding how audience trends are changing and how to recognize, even looking at the, these news bias charts, which kind of range in quality, but at least to get kind of a baseline understanding at where these different outlets fall. But the other side of that is talking to those older populations, those older groups that maybe are quote unquote digital immigrants and haven't grown up with this kind of technology. And so being to understand how to navigate the news environment on Facebook, online, and all these different spaces. So it should be something that's continuing throughout our lifetimes because the media environment is going to continue to change. And that's something we as journalism professors and students and professionals can get out and do and really have that conversation and ensure we're being as transparent as possible with helping people understand how news is made and how good journalism is made. And that's something that still we can really have more conversations about.
Right, Suarez, do you want to add to that teaching media literacy list?
And that's important, and I don't take away from the importance of that at all, but I would add some to the difficulty of it, because simply creating good sources of news is not in and of itself a reliable way to make this happen. It used to be, but the algorithm puts in a variable that makes all of this a much, much more difficult challenge, because the algorithm is constantly using your traffic and the traffic of those in your network to refine what's getting to your eardrums and eyeballs. And if you try to get out of the algorithm to see other things, to graze in places where you don't normally go, to get information you don't normally get, it's actually working against you doing that. And instead of it being an open field where you have a certain amount of agency and choice as to where you roam and what you see, the algorithm's actually making your job harder by pushing refined product toward your eyes that you unwittingly have chosen because of the way you choose your friends. So think about that for a minute.
Yeah. Wow. All right. We're nearing the end, and I think Courtney has popped on the screen just to remind me we are. I do wish we would have had Rick Ducey to tell us all about the evil brokers who are selling or stripping journalism organizations for parts. But I think John Oliver filled in nicely in doing that. And I thank Ray Suarez and Joy Jenkins for putting up with all of our starting jitters on Social Media Week and giving us wonderful answers. And I thank our audience, which numbered in the substantial, somewhere around more than 100 people on this call. And not all of them were dragooned in by their classes and forced to watch. I think a good number of them are voluntarily here and actually heard a good discussion. So again, I think we need to wrap up on that note because within a few seconds of the closing time, but I cannot express how grateful I am to both Ray Suarez and Joy Jenkins for a great discussion, and for John McNair for helping with technical issues, and Courtney for helping put things together, and Barb Kay for reminding me of a few things in the chat. Everybody made this better, and I managed to go along for the ride, and I thank everyone for that. So Courtney, shall we give it back to you and you talk about what's coming on Social Media Week?
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Harmon, for leading this session. We literally in our group chat behind the scenes have been talking about what rock stars Ray and Joy both are. And thank you very much for leading and guiding their conversation throughout. I do want to remind everybody that our next session is at 1:10 p.m. today. It's titled Social Media Gatekeepers or Gate Sleepers. And I think we're going to dive back into the topic of the impact of social media on the journalism industry and where things are headed in that direction. So please join us, follow along on the conversation as well. We have a hashtag for this year's event, and that's hashtag UTSMW21. I'm going to be Vanna White. See it right there? Yeah, okay, there it is on the screen. But thank you all so much. Thanks for everybody that attended, and we will hope to see you all again at 1:10 later today. Thanks.
I know.